you were still a child when Martin Luther King Jr. made his I Have a Dream speech, a speech that contained these words, and I'll quote him: "We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality." Now, you're 65 now. You're no longer a child. And this week you spoke at the funeral of George Floyd. I wonder, when do you think that part of Dr. King's speech will be realised?
It will not be realized until we really confront it legislatively. What made Dr. King so important in world history and American history is all of the movements and the marches and the boycotts that he led and or inspired led to legislation, laws that lived way beyond his own life. Civil Rights Act of '64, Voting Rights Act of 1965, Open Housing Act of '68. We need policing laws that change how policing is governed in this country. And we're beginning to see that in certain states, but we need national laws, which is why Dr. King's son and I are leading an August 28th march on Washington. We need it where police have to wear by law the cameras on them that they can't cut off. We need by law where they cannot use lethal force unless it is no alternative to prevent human life. We need residency laws where they have to live in the cities that they police in. And we need strong civilian review boards that civilians can take complaints and have the power to fire and hire police that have a consistent record of abuses. Unless we put the law and federal law on like King did in his day with the civil rights laws, we will be going from state to state, county to county, fighting on incidents like we're now dealing with the Floyd case in Minneapolis.
And in your career, you have spoken at the funerals of other people who've been victims of police brutality over the decades. And that's why I want to return to this thought about, I suppose, whether the death of this black man, George Floyd, is actually going to change things. I hear what you believe the program for change requires, but if this was going on in 1963 when Dr. King demanded change, and it's still going on now, do you have hope?
Yes, I have a lot of hope, because when I look out and see people of all races, we have in some of the marches and protests as many or more whites than blacks. We never had that before. And I'm seeing people around the world. Right there in the UK, people have marched around this. In South Africa, people, the global aspect. You have to remember when Dr. King and Rosa Parks started the Montgomery boycott in '55, they didn't get a Civil Rights Act till 9 years later, Freedom Riders and all of that. And Jim Crow had been existing for 55 years before the Montgomery boycott. So the struggle takes time, but that's why you have to be persistent and consistent. Nelson Mandela sat in jail 27 years, but he went in prison and came out president. We have to show that real same determination.
You're right. There have been protests in the UK, and more are planned this weekend. There's some controversy. Some people are being told to stay away from anti-racist protests for fear of violence, for fear of counter-demonstrations and so on. I want to ask you specifically, though, about the pulling down of statues. Last weekend, as you know, a statue of a slave trader, Edward Colston, was torn down in Bristol and thrown into a river. And British Prime Minister Boris Johnson said today, "We cannot now try to edit or censor our past. We cannot pretend to have a different history. The statues in our cities and towns were put up by previous generations. They had different perspectives, different understandings of right and wrong." And this is the bit I really want to ask you about. He said, "But these statues teach us about our past with all its faults. To tear them down would be to lie about our history and impoverish the education of generations to come." What do you make of what Boris Johnson said?
I agree with his observation. I disagree with his conclusion. Yes, we shouldn't lie about our history. He's correct. Yes, we should deal with our faults. That's why, in all due respect, Prime Minister, they have museums. You put that in museums and people study that. You do not raise them up for adulation and admiration from the public. That is not instructing them on our mistakes. That is not in educating them on our faults. So I think that when you put somebody up as a statue, that is for people to look up to what they meant in history. And to raise people that were slave traders is to act like there's something admirable about that. And I vehemently disagree with that.
Do you think the people who pulled down the statue in Bristol last week and rolled it and threw it in the river, do you think they were guilty of criminal acts? The British Home Secretary, the Interior Secretary, thinks they were guilty of criminal acts.
I don't know the particulars of what they did, so I couldn't say that they were or were not involved in criminal acts. I did not see what they did, so I don't want to speak to that. I do think the slave trader that they were offended by was involved in criminal acts. Slave trading is a crime.
There's a statue of Winston Churchill opposite the Westminster Parliament in central London that's now been boarded up, and not for the first time in its history, to try to protect it from vandalism. Last week, people scrolled "Churchill is a racist" on it, and that's causing some upset. This is going in an interesting direction, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and I think that Churchill's position on India, Churchill's some of his statements are very troubling. Yes, I understand he was a head of state, which is much different than the slave trader that we talked about a few minutes ago. So I understand why he may be in certain chambers because he was the head of state, but I don't think that excuses the fact that people have the right to protest some of his more colonial leanings and statements.
Do you think he was a racist?
I think he said and did some racist things, whether he sat up in his chambers and said the N-word or other things, I do not know. I know his policies and his advocacy of imperialism was certainly bigoted and certainly was against people of color.
Can I ask you finally about your participation in the service for George Floyd this week? As far as I could see, you were speaking without notes, and I know you're used to doing that in all aspects of your work. I was just wondering where you, on these occasions, find the words.
From my life experiences, I started preaching as a young boy.
You were very young.
So I never very young. I was 4 when I went before my first congregation. So I learned how to speak before I could really read and write well. So I've always been an extemporaneous speaker. But I put in my head several things that I want to communicate. And because I don't just lead the marches and rallies, but I work with the families, I kind of internalize their pain and what they once said. And then I think about where we are in history. So I try to speak to the moment. I try to speak to the family's pain. And I try to use whatever oratorical gifts that I've achieved throughout the years of being in the pulpit and on the platform, and try to put all that together and also give people hope, because I don't want to leave them with just dissecting their pain without saying that I do believe the reason we should keep marching and rallying is that we can turn this around. I've been blessed in my life to have met Nelson Mandela and had several conversations with him. I've met other great people who have shown me that you can win. I was on the stage when Barack Obama was inaugurated president, and I thought about how my mother couldn't even vote in the South until she was almost in her late 30s. So I know we can win. And the only thing that will defeat us is if we become impatient and we resign to the fact that change can't come. No, change can come, and change just needs us to make it become a reality.
One final thought. Are you 100% sure the November presidential election will go ahead on schedule?
I believe it will go ahead on schedule. I believe there will be many that will try to impede people's right to vote, and I believe we must be get up and ready for it. We need to have the election, but we need to protect people's right to vote.
Reverend Sharpton, thank you.